raise your glass up high. Turn it up, it's time. Tall boy on the line. Everything will last. Raise your...
Welcome back to episode 281 of the Tallboy Radio podcast. And we are honored to be joined once more by Lieutenant Commander, retired, I should add, Vernon Geberth. I probably pronounced that incredibly wrong, but I hope
Geberth.
Geberth. Yeah, there we go. I said it with a slightly English twang. So
Okay.
It was close. It was close. Now, there's no Gaz tonight. He's been away and he's not got back in time, unfortunately, but he is back for the episode that we're going to record on Tuesday. So he will be very, very disappointed to be missing this one again. So, Vernon, how are you doing anyway?
I'm doing fine. It's a beautiful day here in Southwest Florida, and I'm happy to join you this afternoon with a very, very complex investigation.
Yeah. So I mean, last time we took a look at a couple of different investigations that you'd done while post sort of retirement. You'd taken an advisory role on, and we're here again to take another look into your case book, as it were. That's all detailed in your fabulous books that you've written. And we're going to take a look at, well, do you want to introduce us a little bit to this case then? Because it's quite famous and notorious in the States.
Well, this is a wrongful death consultation, investigation on my part, consultation on the part of the family. What makes this case so frustrating, and it's very frustrating for me because I'm a murder cop. I like to see justice done. I want the truth. And no matter what we did, we were not going to get the Army to change their mind. They said that this captain in the New York State National Guard committed suicide under the most outrageous conditions. So let me begin with what happened. On March 4th, 1998, the body of Captain Gordon Hess, New York State National Guard, was found dead on the grounds of Fort Knox, Kentucky. He was down for a 2-week training session. He was a tank commander. Now, his body wasn't found when he was first reported missing because it got dark by the time that they did a search. The next day, 4 soldiers found his body in about an inch of bloody water. His clothes were saturated with blood. He was under a rock ledge. And the reason they didn't see his body the first time, because if you were walking across the field, he was under a rock undercrop. There was no weapon found at the scene. Now, these are soldiers, they're not crime scene people. So they traipse through this crime scene. One guy has a coffee cup, it's in the crime scene pictures. Another guy discards his cigarette in the water. It's a complete mess. Anyway, they pick his body up and they place it on an outcropping. And they report they found his body. Now, at the next stage, everybody responds. Fire department, EMT, supervisors, the military police, everybody's in that ravine. In fact, you couldn't tell who was in there. If you were looking for boot prints or anything else, it was gone. Now the investigation begins. At this stage, reportedly, it was being handled as a homicide. He had been stabbed 26 times, 18 times in the left chest, 2 times in the right chest, 6 stab wounds into the strap muscles on either side of his neck. These are devastating wounds. Now, I've handled a lot of multiple stabbing suicides. It's not the number of wounds, it's the lethality of the wounds. I actually had one case in my files where the man stabbed himself 83 times. Wow. It's absolutely amazing. And you have to see these pictures to understand it. So when someone from the outside is looking to pictures in a book and trying to find a frame of reference, it's not going to happen. Anyway, to make a long story short, the wife is notified that her husband was killed on the base. Devastating. He has 3 children. The body is being returned to the family in Jamestown, New York. So when the body's returned on the same day of the funeral, the Army announces that he wasn't killed, it's a suicide. At this point, everybody is like shocked. He's a Jamestown, New York firefighter. He's in the National Guard. He's a husband and father, exemplary record. They don't believe it. The attorney representing the family, Mr. Charles D'Angelo, I call him Chuck. Let me tell you something. If I ever need a lawyer, Chuck D'Angelo is the guy to get because he's a tough litigator. The Army wouldn't release any information. He went after him under Freedom of Information reports, and he actually got the autopsy reports and a lot of the preliminary statements from Army CID. He stops the funeral. He sends the body to the Buffalo, New York Medical Examiner, a forensic pathologist who has a hell of a lot more experience than the military, and he classifies the case as a homicide. So now the Army's in a panic. They have their military doctor who says it's a suicide. They have an outside forensic pathologist saying it's a homicide. Now the fun's going to begin. Now, I don't get involved in this case until July, the end of July. What happened is that Chuck D'Angelo has been putting together a draft book with statements of people who were with him at the base, his fellow employees, and the autopsy report from the military. Would be the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. These guys are not the same as outside forensic pathologists. They don't have the same experience. In fact, that autopsy was number 6 for the year. I would suggest up in Buffalo was 6 for the day. Okay, that's the difference.
I can imagine.
He calls me up. I don't know who he is. And I said, listen, Mr. D'Angelo, I don't do defense work. I'm a murder cop. He says, no. He says, it's a wrongful death, and I want you to review it. I said, well, where did you get my name? Because I pulled it out of a hat. Where's Vernon Geberth? Well, I had taught up in the Jamestown and Buffalo area in the past, and detectives in my class recommended me to him. So I said to him, all right, counselor, send me the material. I'll take a look. Beans, let me tell you something. When I got that autopsy report, and I've read hundreds of autopsy reports in my career, I could not make head nor tail out of this convoluted. I had never seen a protocol that screwed up. In fact, every time I read it, I came up with a different number of wounds. I said, this is crazy. Meanwhile, I'm looking at the autopsy photographs, and the pathologist reporting there were 4 stab wounds in the upper left lobe of the lung. I'm looking at the upper left lobe of the lung. There's 5 probes in it. So is it 4 or 5? Yeah. The heart, 2 stab wounds in the left ventricle of the heart. These are serious, devastating injuries. First thing I did, I said, this is not an investigation. This is going to require a lot of medical interpretation. So I contacted my mentor, one of my mentors, Dr. Dominic J. DeMeo, former chief medical examiner in the city of New York, and we have worked wrongful death cases together. This man is internationally renowned. I send the material to him. I ask him, would you get involved with me in this? He says, yes, I'll take a look. He calls me up and he says, Vernon, who the hell wrote this protocol? I says, Doc, I said, but I'm having a problem. I keep coming up with the wrong number of wounds. He says, so do I. He says, now this is definitely going to require. All right, so we're on. Now we're involved. So I'm getting information from the attorney. I interview his bunkmate, John Burroughs. He's a New York State trooper, was a New York State trooper, on annual leave with Gordon Hess. He could not believe it. I was with him 20 hours a day. He said, this is wrong. What the Army was saying, the reason he committed suicide is because he was responsible for a fratricide. Now, a fratricide is when military personnel get killed by friendly fire. Now, the fratricide incident turned out to be a military video game in which they're given coordinates and they're supposed to strike back. And during that exercise, Captain Gordon Hess's company wiped out half of the 101st military. This is a video game. Nobody got hurt. But the tension and the excitement, there were a lot of fuck yous back and forth, right? And everybody's pissed off. Well, it turns out he didn't fail the exercise. The battalion headquarters gave them the wrong coordinates. And the other team was not where they were supposed to be. It was a land navigation error. So he did not fail. And that's what John, his partner, we had other exercises that same day. Nobody failed. So the Army, strangely enough, is making this case a suicide. I can see where it's going. So I'm interviewing different people.
Yeah.
And it turns out that this major from the National Guard, okay, supposedly had the family's best interests at heart, and he contacted the attorney. So now the major offers to meet with me to discuss this case. So I meet with him at a base up in Newburgh, New York, And he brings crime scene pictures that I hadn't seen. He brings preliminary Army CID reports. And he tells me, there was no weapon found until later when Army CID found his Leatherman tool under an oak leaf. Well, Leatherman tool has a 2.5-inch blade. These are devastating injuries into the intercostal space. We're talking about lethal wounds. So I get he kind of indicates to me that he's on the side of the family. Well, let me tell you something, Beans. I was in the NYPD, the NAP commission, the SIC commission, and all this commission. I can spot a double agent a mile away. I says, this guy thinks he's playing me. I said, okay, so I go along with it, but I can't have anything he shows me. I can't give you the pictures. I can't give you, but you're welcome to look. Well, I looked, and the more I looked, the more I was convinced that this was a homicide. So I said to him, if I were you, I would take advantage of the New York State Medical Legal Office because he's a National Guardsman on duty who gets killed. And so I recommend him to Dr. Barbara Wolf, the New York State Medical Examiner's Office. Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Barbara Wolf, I didn't know her at the time. Later on, we end up team teaching together. She takes a look at what the military has, not what I have, what the military has, what the major has, and she comes back, the manner of death is not in dispute. I mean, the cause of death is not in dispute. The manner of death is, I find it to be homicidal. Now you have two outside people calling this case a homicide. Things are heating up for the military now.
Yeah, I can imagine. So just before we go, I just want to ask you a question then in terms of, so with this being labeled as suicide, so you said there that you'd seen one guy who stabbed himself 83 times. How common a method of suicide is this, where someone stabs themselves to death? It doesn't seem like it's going to be a very common occurrence.
It's not a very common occurrence, and most of the multiple stabbing suicides involve what we call hesitation marks. Now, the Army is going to try to get around that term by claiming superficial is hesitation. No, it's not. You got to see them. And one of the cases that's in literature, and I happen to have it in my files because I'm a forensic expert, is a female who stabbed herself 31 times, and one stab wound went into the heart. Now, if you take a look at the body after it's cleaned up, 13 of those 31 stab wounds are hesitation pricks as she's building up the courage. 18 penetrate and one goes into the heart and she's done. So that's not that common, but it does occur. Wow. And I have a number of multiple stabbing suicides in my files. So when I'm looking at the body of Gordon Hess, I'm saying to myself, there's no way this is a suicide. But more importantly, I'm not a forensic pathologist. So I bring in a forensic pathologist, Dr. Dominic J. DeMeo. Now, after Dr. Barbara Wolf says, no, you have a homicide, now all of a sudden the military's pulling back and they don't want to be my friend anymore. I said, so that's okay. My book, Practical Homicide Investigation, at that time was in its 3rd edition in 1996. The Army was using my book to train their investigators. So on September 1st, through the attorney, Charles D'Angelo, make arrangements for the Army CID personnel and the Chief Operations Officer to meet with me and Dr. DeMeo in Newburgh, New York at a base. So we do. And we go there. And now they're going to show us what they have. It was I like the Chief Operations Officer, a nice guy. He brought my book with him to have me sign it. Would you sign my book, Mr. Geberth? I said, absolutely. I love to destroy books. When I was in Catholic school, I got hit for signing books. So anyway, we take a look at everything. And based on our conversations, it's quite apparent that they're not backing away. So Dr. DeMeo, who's a professional, says, listen, you cannot prove with any degree of medical certainty that your case is a suicide. We cannot prove with any degree of medical certainty that it's a homicide. Why don't you make the classification undetermined and not put this family through that? One of the agents says, we don't accept ambiguity in the military. I said, so Vernon Geberth, being a wise ass, said, what about your commander-in-chief? Because Clinton was the president at the time. So that didn't go over too well, but I could care less. All right, so we can see the lines, and then now they're pushing about this psychological situation, and that's that he was suicidal. Everything that we have doesn't show that. So meanwhile, I'm interviewing different people who were with him. I'm also interviewing other National Guardsmen who happen to be NYPD people that were down at Fort Knox at the same time. I'm speaking to a captain who says, Vernon, this thing was a mess. This crime scene was horrible. Then I speak to another captain who's the one person that the Army CID said, he said it was a suicide. He says, I never meant that. I was just being facetious. Hey, he probably committed suicide off the top of my head. The Army say, no, no. And they take it down and they make his statement that he said the captain committed suicide. Every person that I interviewed said their statements were taken out of context, including Doreen Hess, the wife of the deceased, who they claimed, she said he sighed on the phone like he was frustrated. Never happened. So now they're pushing this. They say, well, how did he kill himself? With a Leatherman tool. And he bought it the night before. He bought that tool to commit suicide. Oh, yeah? Well, the night before, the reason he bought that Leatherman tool is because when he was at a fire in Jamestown, New York, he lost his. Rather than go to the hardware store and pay 4 times the amount, he's going to pick one up at the PX. But they don't mention he also picked up a 437-page book on tank commanders. So are you going to get to read the 437 pages before you kill yourself or not?
No.
Now, in the autopsy, the medical examiner for the military doesn't make any statement about the incised wound on his hand, which could have been a defense wound. In his report, he says the incised wound to Captain Hess was inconsequential in connection with my autopsy. He also doesn't mention that there are 5 post-mortem abrasions on his head from hitting stone after he's dead. Don't forget, he's under this rock, and I can see the 5 post-mortem abrasions. That doesn't count either. So it's very frustrating, obviously.
I can imagine it's very frustrating. I mean, there's a big difference to marks on the hand when you're the attacker and when you're the defender, isn't there? So
Yes.
I would say that wound would be rather pivotal to proving it one way or another.
Well, the first wound is his outer garment over the area of the heart in his chest. So that would look like the first wound that possibly incapacitated him. And then the church opened and he's multiply stabbed. That's a fit of anger and rage type injury. I've seen those. Okay. Well, their statement is he tried to stab himself through the outside garment, but it was too hard. So he opened his shirt and stabbed himself the rest of the way. So Dr. DeMayo said to him, but your medical examiner never correlated the holes in the shirt to the wounds on the body. So now they're going to try to do this after the fact. And things are heating up because there's a lot of material coming out, especially from the people that were down there. The counselor for the family, Chuck D'Angelo, he calls for a press conference on Veterans Day to get publicity about what's happened to this officer and a gentleman, how he's being called a suicide when it's not a suicide. When that was aired and that went out, people in Jamestown went crazy that they would call, this is their town hero, they're going to make him suicide. But more importantly, I get a call from a confidential source, somebody who had been in my class at Fort Knox, Kentucky, all right, who is telling me that within 2 hours, the MACOM commander, which would be the base commander, ordered that case to be a suicide. Just like that. Now, that's why they're scrambling. They got to come up with a reason why they're suicide. They're using the fratricide and a psychological autopsy to justify this. Well, now I have this confidential information. Not only they tell me this, they told me there was evidence of a struggle above the area where the body was found. There was a trail of blood. Then they're saying everybody who should have been interviewed wasn't interviewed. Then I find out that an Army CID officer who was present told his wife that this is a homicide. They want us to make this a suicide. She told her girlfriend, who's married to my informant. So this stuff is leaking. It's leaking like a sieve. So anyway, at that point, the military decides to bring in their forensic consultant, because I'm a forensic consultant. They're going to get a forensic consultant. So they bring in this PhD candidate. He's an academic. He was an Army CID officer. He's going for his PhD, and he's going to construct an equivocal death investigation and justify the suicide. So he starts putting this stuff together. Now it's January. January 1999. I'm in New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm there with Dr. DeMeo. We're doing a 1-week practical homicide school. And who signs up with the chief operations officer and 5 agents are going to sit in the class to challenge us? I was saying, okay. So on the break, it turns out that the major, who supposedly was working for the family, gave our preliminary reports and the information from the lawyer to Army CID. So now he has everything that I wrote in my preliminary report and everything Dr. DeMeo wrote. Now, Dr. DeMeo said, basically, and I'll just, if you don't mind.
No, go for it.
He concluded, in his expert opinion, with a reasonable degree of medical certainty, that the AFIP pathologists have presented insufficient medical evidence to state with a reasonable degree of medical certainty that Gordon Hess' death was due to suicide. In my professional opinion, the captain of Gordon Hess is more consistent with homicide than suicide. That was the preliminary report. In the final report in January of 1999, it consisted of 10 pages in which he describes each of the wound structures, many of which commingled into the same hole on the person's body, that there was enough were penetrated the left young ventricle of the heart, most definitely lethal wounds, and the wounds to the lower right anterior chest into the liver were potentially lethal. He states, in my 50 years of experience as a medical examiner, I have never seen a similar case of suicidal inside wounds of the neck. In conclusion, in my expert opinion, the manner of death is homicidal by unknown persons. That's pretty strong.
That's very strong.
And especially in face of the Army. All right. So what happens is, I'm down there. The chief operations officer, who was working with the forensic consultant, shows me a report of bloodstain pattern analysis. Now, I'm aware of bloodstain pattern analysis. In fact, the people he was quoting is a co-author in one of the books in my series. So he shows me where I wrote the foreword, claiming how good this stuff is. Yes, and it was to a degree. But in 1998, before the elements of taxonomy and all the advances with computer science, it was a discipline that was subject to subjective interpretation. The guy who's doing this is a sergeant major in the Army CID. I'm not saying he's lying. I'm just saying he's prejudiced to make this happen. But it was my belief, and the belief of most people who handled bloodstain pattern analyses in 1998, that clothing that was saturated with blood, you could not do an effective reconstruction because of the saturation into the fabric. Yeah. So I told them, I'm sorry, this doesn't really relate to this investigation. So they got mad at me. Oh, you're going to dismiss it because you don't like it. I says, no, there's no medical certainty here. So then they show me this other report from Dr. Thor Carlson in Sweden, because I made a statement about I have never seen this many multiple stab wounds without the presence of hesitation marks, but I qualified it. I said in the absence of alcohol, drugs, or psychosis. Well, when I looked at the report, yes, there were 18 people that didn't have hesitation marks, but they were drunk, under the influence of drugs, or they were psychotic. That's what I said. So I'm not going to say nothing. I'll look at this and say, I like this report. The Army expert, the academic, did a typical what you do when you do a thesis. He did a literature research, and he found this document. Well, I like that document, especially if you read to the bottom line. It said, in no case was the person able to stab themselves more than one time into the left ventricle of the heart because they would be incapacitated. So I made a snide remark. I said, what are the Swedes know? I'm from the Bronx. They actually put that in their investigative report. Mr. Geberth made a remark about Swedes. I said, yeah, keep it in. So when I came back in January, I notified counsel. I said, listen, they're going to go for this psychological autopsy. Now, a psychological autopsy is a legitimate clinical tool where you attempt to understand what was going on in the mind of the deceased prior to the fatal act. It's a clinical tool. I got a master's degree in clinical psychology. I've used the psychological autopsy, but the psychological autopsy, in order to be legitimate, has to be done at the time of the incident, and all of the parties have to be interviewed. This wasn't done for a year. This is going to be their CYA document. It wasn't done for a year. And in the document, the Navy psychologist says, the decision of the family not to participate will minimally affect my opinion. Yeah, of course, because you don't want to hear from them. So I saw where it was going. So I told counsel, I said, listen, they're going to go with this psychological autopsy. We need to have a general consensus of medical opinion by other outside experts. He said, I agree. So what happens, I contact another one of my mentors, Dr. Leslie Lukash, Chief Medical Examiner of the Nassau County Medical Examiner's Office, former president of the National Medical Examiners Association. On February 19th, 1999, Dr. Lukash provides the following report. There are no hesitation wounds in the area of the stab wounds usually seen in suicides. There's an incised injury to his right arm. The number of wounds is rather large for a suicide, particularly 7 deep wounds. The Leatherman tool shown in the photographs is 2.5 inches long, but they have it going into the deceased body 3 inches. One of the stab wounds has a Y-shaped configuration that implies relative motion between the assailant and the victim, consistent with a homicide attack. The stab wounds perforate the clothing. It's common in suicides for persons to remove the clothing to stab themselves. The knife found at the crime scene didn't have his fingerprints. It is my opinion that the manner of death of the deceased is inconsistent with suicide and more consistent with undetermined manner of death, homicide. So there's the 5th forensic report. Now, not to be undone, I will come up with another dean of medical forensic pathology, Dr. Halbert Fillinger, forensic pathologist, former AFIP pathologist, was the chief medical examiner in Philadelphia and the coroner of Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. And he writes, the cause of death is a result of a number of stab wounds, and the cause of death is not in dispute. However, the manner of death is a different situation. The multiplicity of stab wounds speaks rather strongly against most profiles I am familiar with. The wounds would much more likely have been produced by a homicidal attack rather than the mindset of a suicide. I would rule this case undetermined H, in that while unable to draw a firm determination conclusion, the preponderance evidence points to homicide. Now there's 6 separate, forensic pathology reports. So armed with this information, the attorney is going to make arrangements with 60 Minutes for us to go on 60 Minutes along with the military.
Wow.
And it's a pretty intense presentation. I think you saw it, right, Beans?
Yeah, I did. I watched it, and to be honest with you, it was fascinating, and you're doing a great job of breaking it down and going into a hell of a lot more detail than 60 Minutes did. But yeah, it was a fascinating watch.
Yeah, and they held the Army's feet to the fire, but they weren't going to move. They were relying on that psychological autopsy. So we got to make our statement. So in that respect, the family did get some satisfaction in that the military was being challenged and that loved one did not commit suicide. So I look at this, well, that was nice, but that's not going to get us anywhere. They're going to double down on the psychological autopsy, which they did. Now, interestingly enough, before 60 Minutes took that investigation under their wings, they hired their own pathologists, 3 forensic pathologists who reviewed the military's findings and our findings and concurred with us that it was more consistent with homicide than suicide. When the colonel in the Army was confronted with that, he said, I don't understand how these outside experts should all come to that conclusion. All of the experts in the AFIP agreed it was suicide. Well, that's because the military circled the wagons. They all signed off for each other. The same thing happens in big cities when one medical examiner signs it, all of them agree. They don't like this outside influence. So anyway, when the colonel was confronted with the fact that the Army was using the Carlson report to support their findings of no hesitation wounds, he said, well, we didn't use that report. Well, yes, you did, because I saw it, all right? Well, it turns out that Dr. Carlson was sent the same material in Sweden. And he writes back, more importantly, with this report, the military thought might bolster their hypothesis. He writes back, he writes back that this is more consistent with homicide than suicide. So now we have a seventh report from the outside the military supporting the death as a homicide and not a suicide. Doesn't matter. On March of 1999, the military announces that Army CID investigation has disclosed that the case was a suicide. Well, let me tell you something. They created a 1,300-page document. If you need 1,300 pages to come to a conclusion, you're full of shit. When I was a kid and they did term papers, they used to build up the term paper with a lot of garbage, make the teacher think you were smart, right? This report is loaded with bullshit. And the shame of it is, this man's reputation was ruined for his family, for his kids. I mean, it just was outrageous. I couldn't do any more. We tried our best. We advised Doreen, listen, Doreen, they're not going to change their mind. We got back his dignity with a 60 minutes presentation. Anyway.
So I've got to ask you then, so in terms of, you had all those cases out from the outside where people were looking at it external from the army and saying this looks like homicide. The army is saying no, this is a suicide. Was there anybody outside of the army looking at it and saying there is a possibility that this could be a suicide, or was it that much of a whitewash?
No, everybody on the outside said it was a homicide. Even people that were present, because initially it was being investigated as a homicide, and that was the word I was getting back through my confidential information. But what really, I think, was really insulting is that in 2011, the same academic that put together that report for them established his own clinical journal. So now he has his own journal, and he publishes in 2011, Captain Gordon Hess, Homicide or Suicide, an equivocal death analysis and case study. Well, that basically copies the format of what I did in 2000. But in his report, he's giving misinformation. He's showing the picture of a crime scene that's supposedly intact and there was no contamination. Within 2 days, the military dumped 2.5 tons of dirt on that crime scene, ostensibly because of biohazards. No, what you did is you obliterated the crime scene. If, in fact, we wanted to do boot print analysis or soil analysis or anything like that, it wasn't going to be able to be done. So from the get-go, once that base commander decided it was going to be a suicide, that's the way it was going to go. And why was that? Because it's a training base. It wouldn't look good to have a homicide on your base.
Absolutely not.
So
no.
it boils down to optics.
Yeah, oh yeah, I don't doubt it. And I must admit, when I was watching the 60-minute bit and they had the bit where they talked about dumping all the soil on top of it because it was a biohazard. They said the blood was a biohazard. It just screamed whitewash. It just screamed cover up. It was unbelievable.
Well, I call this a fairy tale thesis, okay? Because in the retelling, he's making stuff up. But I think, well, really, you know it's personal. When he writes, the bottom line, it says, we work for truth. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
We work for God. If that isn't personal, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
So since you're going to rely on the psychological autopsy, I got to share with you this psychological autopsy. In February of 1999, the Navy psychologist submits this clinical review. He states that the family's decision not to cooperate will not impact his opinion. He then concludes that the victim self-inflicted numerous lethal and non-lethal stab wounds either to relieve his stress or to punish himself due to his own self-perceived feelings. He writes, I hypothesize that Gordon Hess possessed significant vulnerabilities, perfectionism, and intolerance for his own failings. Hess was overly fixated on this incident and is significantly stressed. His status as a role of a military officer and commander was critical to his identity. Thus, the image of himself was shattered. Hess experienced a dissociated-like state of mind, likely experienced some relief from his internal tension. He then concludes, self-destruction is symbolically like self-mutilation, which is understood as a mechanism for relieving tension as well as punishing yourself for perceived inadequacy. I call this report psychobabble.
Yeah.
Okay, pure psychobabble. This is the report that's going to justify their findings.
Yeah,
I tell you.
And the people who were with him then, the people who did the mission or the war games, as it were, where it went very, very badly, they didn't seem to think that he put too much pressure on it from himself, that he didn't seem to react to it, but, you know, as they are saying, as a massive, massive overreaction. He took it, I'm not gonna say he took it well, because he's gonna, you know, I'm sure any man in that position doesn't like to fail or get things wrong, even if it isn't, as it turns out, his fault. But he didn't put that level of pressure on it, according to those around him, did he?
No, in fact, his second in command said we had other exercises that day that we were the shining star.
Mm.
Okay, so it wasn't that. Now, he did meet somebody out there, and nobody talks about the coffee found in his stomach at autopsy. Where did he get that coffee? Because when he got up that morning and put on his sweats, right, his locker, he laid out his uniform, his shaving kit, he was going to meet somebody. Somewhere he got coffee. He was in the non-coms barrack prior to that, looking for coffee. There's usually a 30-urn pot that's up there, but that day there was no coffee. So somewhere else he got coffee. And he drank that coffee, and at some point he is stabbed through the outermost garment, over the heart, through the outside garment into his chest. Possibly that was the incapacitating wound. I don't know. I'm not speculating. In the academics report, he uses the word speculation and hypothesis 8 times. We don't use that word at all. Okay. I think that, again, you know how passionate I am about my cases and my feelings about victims and victims' families. I want to read you Doreen's impact statement when it was concluded. She writes, the mental and emotional toll of having to defend the life of a loved one is completely overwhelming. Being told by an entity that they know my husband, Gordon, better in death than I did in my 20 years of life has been but pouring salt into an open wound. It is beyond painful. 2 years after his death, the use of antidepressants became a normal way of life for me and has been for 18 years. Raising 3 young children of my own became a daily struggle as well. I have nightmares, dreams where I'm with Gordy and Gordy's guard trying to find out who killed him. The scenario varies. My older children, the older the children became, the more questions they had along additional worries. What if something happens to mom? Then what happens to us? Why didn't anyone look at dad's killer? Why did the life seem insignificant to this entity? Did he become acceptable casualty? Why didn't they listen to our mom and dad would never leave us willingly? The mental and emotional pain still lingers along with frustration and anger. Thank you for your continued efforts and hard work on our behalf. We appreciate beyond words. Doreen Hess, widow of Captain Gordon Hess. That's heavy.
That is incredibly heavy. There's a lot of very, very serious questions there. And where you can understand that the army wouldn't want there to appear to have been a homicide taking place on one of their training bases, we can understand how that looks to them. But I think I think sometimes you've just got to take a long, long look at that and listen to those words, which are very, very powerful. And to be fair, immense control to be able to put them out there. So fair play to it for being able to do that. But you know, to have the children, that weight pressure upon them, and just lies told in such a fashion, it's damaging to the man's reputation. It's difficult for his children to hear that as he's growing up and know that it's portrayed to be a lie, and that there's a danger that people could believe that. But the flip side of it as well is out there. Somebody has got away with murder. There's somebody who should be punished for what they have done.
Basically, someone got away with murder. Now, again, I'm vested in this because I met the wife and the family, and I talked to everybody who was with him there, especially those NYPD guys that were on maneuvers. They told me from their perspective what was going on. This is 27 years later. I want Doreen Hess and her family to get some relief. And that's why we're having this discussion today, because the stuff that's online is confusing, especially at that alleged clinical report, because Again, it's the latest thing that's up there. My report's buried along those lines. But in my textbook, in chapter 22, I have the whole case laid out with photographs and descriptions and the material we discussed today because it had to be told. The difference is it's not an article that you get online and pick up right away. And that's the problem. The truth has to be told. And hey, I work for God, but don't tell me you work for truth. Not if you wrote that bullshit report.
No, that's. I mean, it might be a jab at yourself. I'm sure it is. But gee whiz, it's a very bold claim to make when you just talked out your arse for 100 other pages. It's just ridiculous, isn't it?
It is. And basically, I just want to discuss this one case with you today. I don't want to complicate the presentation. You have
No.
any questions? You have any questions on anything? I'm happy to ask them.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of it all, so first of all, they're going to try and claim it's a suicide, and the weapon there, the Leatherman, has a 2.5-inch blade, and yet the blade, is, the depth of the wounds is 3 inches. I mean, that surely isn't possible that weapon could have been used, then, is it?
Well, I don't see the Leatherman tool going through the intercostal space. It'll be a rib cage. And 14 of those go through the intercostal space. When you take the breastplate out, you can see it. In my textbook, I put the breastplates down to show these going through. It's also quite evident to me that the military pathologist was being influenced by Army CID with their stories about the fratricide and he's nervous and this and that and the tool. They made a big deal about finding the package in the garbage outside the barracks. Well, there's no doubt he bought it. He lost one in Jamestown, New York. But they never mentioned he bought a 437-page book. Why didn't you mention that? Because that would go against their idea. It is very frustrating.
Yeah, exactly. If you're buying a 437-page book the day before you're planning on committing suicide, it doesn't really add up, does it? It does just lends more weight that it points towards homicide. So the Leatherman is sorry, go on.
I was going to say, if this guy was so clinically depressed, how come he played a game of pickup basketball that night with his troops? And right, had a couple of beers and was standing around. And then one of them had a groin pull, so he accompanied him to the hospital to make sure he was okay. I mean, that doesn't sound like someone who's clinically depressed.
No, it absolutely does not. And the weapon itself, then, so like you say, so it wasn't visible at the scene. It didn't appear to have any of his fingerprints on it. It didn't appear to have any of his marks on it. So that casts further doubt that could possibly have been used in this crime.
I don't think that was the weapon. The trouble with penetrating wounds with sharp-edged instruments, you can only say it's consistent or inconsistent. And very limitedly do you get that ability. Like say there's a serrated blade or it's a long bayonet type blade. I mean, you can say more about it. But a knife wound is a knife wound. You can only say so much about it. It's not like ballistics where you have the bullet that was fired that came from this gun and blah blah blah. You can't do that. But I think it's remarkable that we have 7 forensic pathologists, all of whom have an international reputation, of basically saying you're wrong. You can't do that. But they did it anyway. And if you're going to hang that whole investigation on a psychological autopsy, which was basically psychobabble, if you're going to hang your reputation on, well, that's a sad state of affairs.
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the interesting thing about the wounds is as well. So there were 2 wounds to the ventricle, weren't there? Which in itself was unique.
The left ventricle, the heart. Yeah, one would be enough to incapacitate you. Okay, now I've presented this case at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and I've had pathologists all in agreement. In fact, in one of my presentations, I brought Dr. Wolf with me to give her interpretations, and in the class was the chief operations officer and 6 CID agents. And I saw them staring at us as we're going through this report, and I said, you know something? If I was sitting there in your position, I would want to defend myself. So I'm taking my microphone off, I'm giving it to you, and you tell us what happened. It was shocking. Later on, he said, you're a class act. I didn't expect that. I said, well, I wanted to give you a chance to respond. I wouldn't want to hear me talking about without a chance to respond. And that's what I did.
No, fair play. So yeah, well, and this is the thing, for someone to inflict 2 wounds to the heart, we would say then would not be possible. It is not possible to do that to yourself.
Not one pathologist agreed with that. Not one pathologist. And I was interesting on the 60 Minutes presentation, the colonel, he was funny. Oh, people have been shot through the heart and ran for a block. Well, a shot through the heart's not the same as ripping open the heart. All right? It goes in and out. It's a perforating type of wound. You're not going to go very long. But even in the report that the academic, I call him the academic, put together, well, the wounds were not instantaneous. They may have been lethal, but they weren't instantaneous, and they weren't incapacitating. Well, you're not a doctor. And if you had to look at pictures in my book and Dr. DeMayo's book to try to find out what they look like, shame on you, because I've seen them, and the rest of the doctors have seen them. One funny part about this, when I told Chuck D'Angelo, the attorney, I said, we're going to get 2 more deans of forensic medicine involved. He calls me up and says, Vernon, don't you have any friends under 80 years of age? I said, these were my mentors. These are the top people in the world. That's who's telling us the truth. And their opinion means a hell of a lot more than some guy in an Army AFIP doing his studies to become a board certified forensic pathologist.
Yeah. It was one of those cases when I was watching the 60 Minutes episode that you sent me that it blew my mind, to be honest with you. The idea that anybody could try and play this off as a suicide, I just thought, why? It's just give it up. You know what I mean? It's clearly nonsense. You know, the very fact that you're clinging to it means you have something in it. You've got skin in this game because you're clinging to this so desperately when it makes no sense whatsoever. You're demonstrating the duplicity here, you know, that you are.
You're intractable, and you won't listen. You won't listen to the experts that are telling you. Listen, you have a way out of here. All you got to do is say undetermined. It will satisfy the family of the deceased, but also it's more in line with medical certainty. It's undetermined. That's a legitimate manner of death. Okay, it's again. 27 years, Doreen Hess has been waiting to have her husband's name cleared and her family name cleared for her children. And hopefully in this presentation, I leave it open to the people who are watching us. Go online. Get a hold of don't buy it. Go to the library. Get chapter 22, equivocal death. Read what's going on. And you make your own decision. Is it homicide or suicide? I leave it up to you.
Well, I went into this open-minded because it's not a case I'd ever heard of before. And to me, it just absolutely screams of an open and shut case of homicide, which then begs the question, like you say, is who perpetrated the act? Has it been looked into who he was meeting that day or who he had the coffee with?
No one's looking at this case. And it was interesting because after the fact, when I was at the American Academy, there's a whole bunch of people from Army CID that belong to the American Academy. I've had individual agents come up to me and say, Mr. Geberth, I read your report. I think we're going to try to reopen this case. You're not going to reopen this case. The chain of command has basically told you this is how it is. This is not Air Force OSI or NCIS. This is the Army CID. And the MACOM commander, he outranks everybody. Suicide. And that's what I said in the program. In the Army, you may have a suicide, but in the outside world, you look pretty dopey. Because everybody else can see right through it.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. How frustrating is it for you then when you can see something like this has happened? This happens in the civilian world. It's going to get investigated thoroughly and properly. The crime scene could be impacted on by its found. You don't know who comes across it first. It's in water. I imagine that will have its own weight and difference as to how the evidence is preserved. But if this is a civilian case, it's going to get ruled a homicide, and then
absolutely.
we're going to be looking,
absolutely.
and we're going to be we're looking then at who's done it. Which is the whole point of investigating these things, and that's the thing. It's not an investigation. I think the phrase used was a rush to judgment, and I think, it was more than a rush to judgment. It was this is what's happening.
It was a cover-up.
It's
basically a cover-up. And it wasn't a homicide investigation. It was a suicide investigation. And how do we make it a suicide? And, I have a whole chapter in my textbook on suicide and the different types and what people can do. And I have made statements relative to suicide, what's going on in the mind of the deceased when they do that. Um, the academic nitpicked some of my remarks about suicide and tried to put that in his report, which is fairy tale thesis, I call it, to justify it. And I like the last line of the report. You make up your mind. It's suicide or homicide. Well, I'm saying the same thing. You make up your mind. Here's the facts. Seven separate forensic pathologists are telling you it's not a suicide, and you don't want to believe them.
So is it done now? Is there absolutely no way that this could be reinvestigated? It's never going to be reopened. Does this poor family then have to live with that this guy has been murdered and nobody is going to do a damn thing about it in terms of bringing whoever's done it to justice?
No, somebody got away with murder, and that's fine with them because they don't have a homicide in their base. So, once again, you know where I'm coming from. I'm pure of heart. This is like I don't have a dog in the fight, so to speak, but I do have the desire for justice and for the truth to come out. And I couldn't put together that group of forensic pathologists today that I did back then. And it was kind of funny because when I recommended the major, who was the double agent, when I recommended him go to New York State to see Dr. Barbara Wolf, I didn't know Dr. Barbara Wolf, but I knew her reputation as a forensic pathologist. It's a small world out here in forensics. We all know each other and what our capabilities are. And when she came back with that second homicide, I was saying, here we go. Stand by.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you must have known that that's what she was going to come back with anyway, and this guy must have known, and he was there to defend it. So are we assuming then, and I know I'm not asking you to point the finger or blame anything or make any statements that are damning, that whoever perpetrated this crime was on that base anyway? I don't
Absolutely.
know how. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that have to be.
The police weren't allowed. When the police responded, they weren't allowed on the base. In fact, later on, when I was doing a presentation in New York State for the New York State Police, there was a young lady who was on patrol that day, and I saw her head going up and down like a Cupid doll when I was talking. So on the break, I said, "What's going on?" She goes, "I was there. That was a homicide." So, you go with what people tell you.
Yeah.
It was kind of funny because when the family did that presentation on Veterans Day, the people in Jamestown, New York, they petitioned their congressman. This is wrong because the military had issued a suicide. Well, he went to the Department of Defense, all right, the Secretary of Defense, and talked to him about it. And they reissued one that says undetermined. But that wasn't the CID investigation. That was a military report. And everybody was all excited. I remember some reporter from Buffalo called me up. "Mr. Geberth, you were right. They've changed it." I said, "No, it's not changed. That report is not the Army CID's final say. That is from the Department of Army trying to satisfy the congressman and his constituents. Watch." And sure enough.
So, just out of interest, then, you have a much better idea of how these things work and how American politics work. You mentioned Clinton there earlier. If defendant or chief, whatever you want to call him, chief of staff Donald J. Trump decides he wants to reopen this and he wants it looked at and he wants to investigate thoroughly, could that happen?
I don't see that happening because too many years have transpired and many of the people are no longer available. Okay. Who was on that base that day 27 years ago? Now this is a done deal, and they got their disposition that they want, but I'm here on this program to tell the truth and show what really happened. And for the family's sake, that's why I'm here. Not for Vernon's sake. I could care less. My book speaks for itself.
Yeah, I believe you. I do believe you on that one. So is there any part of you that believes that the people who've covered this up know exactly who's done it?
I'm sorry, Beans?
Is there any part of you that believes that the person and the people who've covered this up know who's responsible for the crime?
No, because they didn't do a homicide investigation. They did a suicide investigation. Don't forget, I was told that not everybody who should have been interviewed was interviewed. Now, they interviewed 130. I interviewed 24. All right. But the 24 I interviewed was one of the people who supposedly said it was a suicide, and he was misquoted. And he told me what he said. So you can see what happened.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You can see what happened. It's plain for all to see. I do. I think it's a shame. It is a real shame. It's a travesty. It's a miscarriage of justice. Well, it's not a miscarriage of justice. There's no
Yeah.
justice at all, and that's frustrating. It must be incredibly frustrating for yourself to be involved with that and not be able to see it through to the conclusion and be able to say this is the person who's done it. You know, we have to live with, and I suppose were it to be reinvestigated as well. There's no evidence anymore. Like you say, 3 days
Yeah.
later, the army.
Everything's gone. Everything's gone. It's a shame. That's why it was so important to get those independent forensic pathologists to do their review at the time they did it.
Yeah.
Okay? Because they had all that information from the military medical examiner in the early stages of the investigation. We couldn't have done any more, Beans. We did as much as we could. I was with that case over a year. It feels over a year. It followed me in my career at the American Academy of Forensic Science because the academic was a big shot there. He was giving me a hard time, but that's another story for another time.
No. So hopefully then people will take the time, go and do a little, we've given them pretty good deep dive into this, to be honest with you. It's rare that we'll spend this amount of time looking and talking about one case. But like you say, when it's something as important as this, when it's a man's honor and a man's dignity that's brought into question, then I do think it's worthwhile. I think it's really worthwhile that we go out there and we understand.
I thank you for the opportunity, but again, I'm not telling people what to think. Go online, take a look at my report, take a look at the fairy tale thesis, get a hold of my practical homicide book, and you'll see chapter 22. It is what it is, and again, that's all we can do. We can't do anything much more than that. The bottom line is this is the world we're in.
Yeah. Gee whiz. Yeah, it's a world that stinks at time. Remember that, folks. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about your books, where they can be found as we're wrapping this episode up. If anybody does want to find them, like you say, the fairly weighty tombs, the fairly expensive tombs as well. I don't mind telling you.
You got The Godfather Homicide, which is my life story, and it tells how I got to be where I got. And then we have this thing that requires 2 hands to pick it up. This is the 5th edition of Practical Homicide Investigation, which basically covers just about every kind of death you can think of, because I knew that was my last hurrah, and I wanted to leave a permanent record for people to use. I would love to know how many cases were solved because of my book and the people that took my training. And God bless them for continuing to pursue the Practical Homicide protocol. The Army no longer uses my book, by the way. The academic wrote his own book, so they're using his book now. So
I'd like to see the copy there somewhere that does get used. In this case, they might not use it because they wanted to learn practical suicide rather than practical homicide. But gee whiz, I think it's there somewhere. I do believe that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we're going to wrap this up. We're round about the hour mark, which is where we like to leave these things. Seldom do we do an episode where we look at one case that lasts for an hour. However, like you say in this one, really, really important that we did, and a really, really valid use of our time. And what I would do is implore anybody who listens to this, just go and understand reasons why this happened. Have a look into it. Let's not let that statement that they've made, let's not let their judgment be the judgment that everybody else takes. We can all choose to ignore that and understand the facts and the truth. Because at the end of the day, whether you do it for truth or whether you do it for God, gee whiz, you
don't need a 1,300-page investigation report, okay? I'm sorry. I've never seen that before in my life. But
no, that's the definition of overkill, isn't it?
All right, Beans. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm sure that Doreen Hess and her family will feel better about getting this material. Chuck D'Angelo, the attorney. I told you, if I ever get in trouble, I want Chuck D'Angelo. The guy's a bulldog, and did a great job.
Fantastic. So Vernon, thank you very much. I look forward to the next time we will sit down and we take another look through your case file. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir. Take care.